Stormtroopers in the corporate world, they're the ones who are chasing numbers, but they never seem to achieve very much. Whereas the Jedi in the corporate world, they're the ones who seem to have this outsized impact. They really know how to create change. But here's the thing, how do you actually build this Jedi discipline? Now finally, you have the recipe for how you can create change. The real question is, do you want to be the stormtrooper who is dispensable, replaceable, and who leaves no mark? Or do you want to be the Jedi who is invaluable, the protagonist creating change, and who leaves a legacy?
Have fun.
Thank you, Sebastian. So, I'm super excited to be here. And what I want to start with is, I'll give you a quick overview of radical product thinking, but I want to give you a sneak preview of the second book that I'm working on. And true to the name, radical product thinking, we are going to be radical and challenge some conventional thinking. So let's get ready. Now, in radical product thinking, I talk about some of the most common product diseases. Right? And these are diseases that make good products go bad. They're diseases like pivotitis, where we chase one shiny idea after next, right? And sometimes every sprint looks like a new pivot based on which customer is screaming the loudest. Anyone face that? Yeah. And then there is obsessive sales disorder. This is the product disease that I have contributed to myself. Right? This is when your salesperson has this glimmer in their eye and they tell you, ooh, if you just add this one custom feature, we can win this mega deal. And so we say, yes, let's do this. And pretty soon your entire roadmap is driven by all the things that you have to make good on, right? Sounds familiar? Yeah, excellent. And then there are other really common diseases, like narcissist complex, where we're so focused on what we need or what our company needs that we get disconnected from what our users actually need. Right? And there are other product diseases like that that I talk about in the Radical Product Thinking book. And what I find is that those are the diseases that happen when our vision doesn't systematically translate into our everyday activities, when there's a break in the chain. And that's what radical product thinking addresses. How do you systematically translate vision into your everyday activities? But you know what? Since then, I've realized that there's a more chronic disease that is a real and major threat that we have to deal with. And this is a chronic disease in our very way of being. Right? And I like to call this disease stormtrooperism. Have you ever noticed how in the Star Wars movies, you see stormtroopers, they're firing lots, right? They fire lots and they never seem to hit anything that actually matters? Well, the Jedis, on the other hand, right? They are disciplined. They set intent, they sense, they learn, they adapt. It's this reflection-based discipline. Well, the stormtroopers in the corporate world, they're the ones who are chasing numbers. Right? They chase numbers, but they never seem to achieve very much. They seem to hit all those numbers, though. Whereas the Jedi in the corporate world, they're the ones who seem to have this outsized impact. Right? An outsized impact, and they seem to really know how to create change. But here's the thing. How do you actually build this Jedi discipline of setting intent, sensing, learning, and adapting? Because in the Star Wars movie, and by the way, this has bothered me for decades, this whole thing of just use the Force, just people seem to know exactly what to do with that, right? Luke Skywalker, he hardly got any training, and yet he seemed to just know how to use this Force. I think in reality, it's just really hard to know. How do you just use this Force? And so this is where I want to introduce you to this framework that I call OHLs. objectives, hypotheses, and learning, and they help you build this Jedi discipline of experimentation, learning, adaptation. And it's through this mindset of puzzle setting and puzzle solving. And so to illustrate what I really mean by stormtrooperism versus being a Jedi to navigate change and how to do this puzzle setting and puzzle solving, I want to give you the example of Intel. Now at Intel, Andy Grove was the master Jedi. Right? He was the CEO from 1987 to 1997, and he drove experimentation, learning, and adaptation across the whole organization. And that is how he transformed Intel from a memory chips company to what we know Intel as today, this consumer brand in microprocessors. Now, what I find interesting, right, is in his book, Measure What Matters, John Doerr talks about Andy Grove as the father of OKRs. He makes it sound like Andy Grove was successful because of OKRs. But that's not actually what happened. In fact, in his own book, when Andy Grove talks about the story of Intel and how he transformed the company, he doesn't even mention OKRs. He doesn't even mention OKRs. What he instead emphasizes is this approach of experimentation, learning, and adaptation, that is what we need to really build companies, grow companies, innovate. But here's the problem. Leaders like Andy Grove, they have this intuition. They seem to just know how to use the Force. He had this intuition and an innate gift for experimentation, learning, and adaptation. And so what he left us with as a framework for how do you do this was, he said, you have to let chaos reign and then reign in chaos. He might as well have just said, use the Force, people. And so this is where I want to explain how we can use OHLs. And you can use OHLs for setting the puzzle and then solving the puzzle. So let's talk about this Intel example for how you go forth and you set this puzzle. So first, you have to start with the problem statement. At Intel, the problem statement was that the memory chips business was just really getting destroyed. Intel was the leader in memory chips, and then there were Japanese competitors that came along. They had better technology and a higher density in transistors, et cetera, and they were outperforming Intel. And Intel's market share was just plummeting. And so there were some guiding questions that needed to be asked. And Andy Grove talks about it in his book. He says, we had to figure out, is this signal or is this noise? Is this just a blip or is this a fundamental change in the market? And then they had to look at, well, can we invest in the memory business to really regain market share? Should we? And the question really was, the puzzle, the summary of this puzzle is this objective, which is, how should the company evolve to be able to adapt to this changing marketplace? Right, so this was the puzzle. And once you've set the puzzle, you can then use OHLs as a framework to really take this guided reflection approach, reflection-based approach, to be able to solve this puzzle. And it involves asking 3 questions. So the first question is, how well did it work? Notice that it's not a binary question, did you or did you not hit this goal? It is a question that invites the good and the bad. And then the second question, which is, what did you learn? This is where it's not just about the numbers. It's super important to measure numbers, but you have to interpret the numbers and say, what have we learned? And then comes the third question, which is, if I were to give you a magic wand, what would you ask for? And so here's how they looked at these questions, right? So the first thing was, well, how well is it working? Meaning, they had invested in R&D on microprocessors for a whole decade. Right? So how well is that working? So what they realized was, our microprocessor business is actually growing and it's subsidizing the declining memory business. So what did they learn from this? Right? What they realized was, we could invest 100 million in trying to get our memory chips business going again, and maybe we can command 2x the price of our competitors. But here's the problem. When your market is getting commoditized, right, and the price is going towards zero, well, 2 times 0 is still a grand fat 0. And so, should we? And here was the last realization. And this is where Andy Grove was this Jedi about learning and experimentation, right? Because he wanted to get the truth from the trenches, from the frontline middle managers. So he didn't have a corner office like a CEO. He had a cubicle like everyone else because he wanted to sense, learn, and adapt. And so he learned that all of the middle managers were already seeing the reality. They were already divesting and moving towards growing the microprocessor and investing more resources in microprocessors rather than in memory. It was actually the executives who were really stuck on Intel's identity as a memory chips company. In fact, one executive said, if we were to give up our memory business, it's like Ford giving up cars. And so here's the last question, which is, if we had a magic wand, what would we try next? And so this is where Andy Grove, he talked to Gordon Moore, the chairman, and he said, what would a new CEO do? And Gordon Moore didn't skip a beat. He instantly said, well, they would kill the memory business. And this is where Andy Grove said, well, in that case, why aren't we doing it? So that's what they did. They pretended they had a magic wand. They walked out of the room, decided they were the new CEOs, came back in, and killed the memory business. And that is how Intel became what we know of it, right? This consumer brand. It wasn't transformed by chasing numbers. It was transformed through experimentation, learning, adaptation. But what happened when there were stormtroopers? There were lots of successors after Andy Grove, and OKRs were alive and well during their reign. And so during the stormtrooper reign, where you had CEOs like Paul Otellini, Bob Swan, etc., from 2005 until 2021, the numbers were looking fantastic. But here's the problem. What they did was they missed all the important elements. They missed everything that mattered. When Apple asked them to supply chips for the iPhone, they said, nah, we just don't think that's enough volume. Later, when everyone else was investing in extreme ultraviolet technology so that they could build denser chips, Intel didn't. They turned down an investment in OpenAI. And then you know what they did? They decided that this whole standalone GPU, nah. And that's how NVIDIA got their lead, right? They missed everything that matters, and that's how Intel declined. So my point is, what we need to be able to grow our organizations, it requires Jedi discipline, not stormtrooperism. But here's the thing. Now, in this AI overdrive mode, what we need even more is Jedi discipline. And there's just so much less room for stormtrooperism. There's just less of a need for stormtroopers. Why is that? It's because stormtroopers have always been very easily replaceable, right? And AI is like a super-duper stormtrooper that can optimize for metrics. And so if what we're doing is chasing metrics, then it begs this question, that if you were okay with stormtrooperism and thinking that the company values you because you are able to optimize for metrics, in the age of AI, it begs the question, well, why do I need you as the PM if AI can optimize better? But don't feel like this is just coming for PMs. If you're a leader, it's coming for you too, because then the next question is, well, why do I need a chief product officer when I can have the remaining PMs just report this to the CTO? Because after all, well, it's the tech that's doing the optimization. So in the age of AI, it begs the question, what is your value add when AI can be the super-duper stormtrooper? So this is why we really should not abdicate our differentiation to AI. And the differentiation you bring is this Jedi discipline of sensing, learning, adapting, right? The experimentation-based approach. So here's to acknowledge what AI can help us do. AI is super powerful, and yes, it can help us achieve the change that we want to bring, right? It will help you code faster, create UI faster, create content faster, etc., so that you can achieve what you want. But without Jedi discipline, what we risk is creating AI slop. And what do I mean by AI product slop? It's just like the content slop, right? How many of us can recognize AI content the moment we read it? And we find it irritating, right? There's also AI product slop that we could create if we're not Jedis. And what I mean by that, it's the quickly created mediocrity that we can fill the world with that then has long-term fatigue effects for users and has unintended consequences for society. So I want to give you an example of what I mean by this. And the example that I want to give you is that of dating. So this isn't necessarily AI slop, right? Humans did it, but I want you to picture how much faster we can create this sort of AI slop using AI. But this we did just with humans optimizing for metrics. And they optimized the right metrics. The metric that they optimized was user engagement. That's exactly the right metric to optimize. So what happened? In 2013, Tinder introduced swipe left and swipe right? And that sent user engagement just skyrocketing. And everyone said, ooh, I like this. And they all copied Tinder, right? So OkCupid, Bumble, everyone had their version of swipe left, swipe right. And so what happened? The more intimacy got gamified, the more it created a toxic dating environment where people were no longer treating each other like humans. And the end result was there was this backlash of dating. In fact, there was so much dating app burnout that a lot of people deleted dating apps, and the entire industry was in a slump. So all the short-term metrics that were optimized for were great. In the short term, it looked good. In the long term, it killed the whole dating industry. And recently, Bumble laid off 30% of all of its staff. So this is what I mean, that we could optimize for metrics using AI even faster than we could just as humans, right? But unless you bring Jedi discipline, you can't save the world from AI slop. You can, though, if you just use Jedi discipline. So, oops. What do you do? Here. We're running into tech issues, but let's. So, how would Jedis think about the puzzle of dating instead of optimizing metrics? And the answer to that is, well, you would think about how would we reduce the dehumanization, right? There's so much overwhelming FOMO, etc., when you use dating apps. So the problem statement is, how would you reduce that? And some of the guiding questions might be things like, well, how can we make interactions better? Maybe we can nudge users to actually respond to someone as opposed to hearing crickets. You might ask questions like, how do we reduce the FOMO and this feeling like it's an unlimited just pool that you keep wading through? And so in terms of summarizing the objective, if you're in a Jedi mindset in the same dating app, you would ask the question, how can we create a better dating experience. We wouldn't just optimize for numbers. Right? This is the Jedi mindset with which we can avoid AI product slop. So at this point, you might ask the question, okay, great. Now I see the power of puzzle setting and puzzle solving. And you talked about Intel, how we can use this Jedi mindset, but have you used this to create better business results? Because I have shareholders and I have to show them results, right? We all have to show them results. And so the example that I want to show you is that of Signal Ocean. And this is a company that I've been working with for about 2 years now. So in 2023, the CEO brought me in. And he brought me in because Signal's sales had stalled. So what does Signal do? Signal is a maritime data analytics company, and the easiest way to explain is they help the maritime industry figure out what are the best vessels to match with which cargoes. So what happened? Well, the CEO had brought in OKRs to Signal because he really wanted to drive ambition in the team, right? To drive good results because sales had stalled in 2023. And so they had exactly the kind of OKRs that you would expect. It's the kind of OKRs that, that are prescribed, right? You might have OKRs about sales, increasing weekly active users, various engagement metrics that you want to increase, all the right sorts of OKRs. So what happened? One thing I observed when I came in was I was seeing that when I asked the team about how is the product doing, I would often get answers in terms of numbers. Very often the numbers were about, our weekly active users is blah, blah, our number of, our growth is blah, number of clients, just all sorts of metrics that I was hearing. But here's the thing, it wasn't changing reality. It wasn't changing what was actually happening. Sales and usage weren't really breaking through in terms of growth. And I was realizing that it was just triggering the left brain. So I realized that we needed a new mindset. So this is where we brought in puzzle setting. And so in terms of setting a puzzle, I want to give you just one example, right? And the example that I want to give you is for the mobile app. So what we did was we said, okay, let's look at the mobile app. The problem statement is that it looks like a lot of our users are using the desktop app, but just nobody is seeming to use the mobile. Why is that? So here are some guiding questions. Do they know about the mobile app? Like maybe they don't. Are we offering the right functionality? Is this actually making sense for our users? And how might we increase stickiness and adoption? And then finally, the question was, and this is the summary of the puzzle, how can we make Signal the platform that users go to even when they're on the go? So what did we do? In terms of puzzle solving, this is where the product manager went back and she looked at all of the data and she asked, how well are things working? And the answer to that was, well, great. It turns out that some of the personas are indeed using the same functionality on the mobile app as on the desktop, but a lot of the people actually seem to have very different questions when they're using the mobile app. Interesting. So what did you learn from this? So that's where, instead of just telling me numbers, what she did was she looked at all the numbers and she figured out what's actually happening on the app. And what she figured out was, aha, here's the list of questions that people seem to have in their minds. And in the order of priority, here are the questions. And one such question is, when will my vessel arrive at a particular port? So then comes the last question. What would you do next? And this is where, what she tried was she said, aha, maybe we need a different way of just helping these users navigate to those different questions that they have in their head. And now we know exactly what usage we want to optimize, right? Like what what are the areas where we want to optimize UI, because we know what questions they seem to have in their head. So now imagine every single part of the platform where we started using this approach. All the product managers, we started having learning meetings where we would talk about how well are things working, what have we learned, what are we going to do next? And then we started using this in the monthly business reviews. So instead of just talking about OKRs being green, yellow, or red, we talked about what have we learned and what are we going to do next. We use this for design sprints to be able to figure out what have we learned and what are we going to do next every single day based on how well things were working. And by taking this approach, we increased sales. We doubled sales in 2024 and 2025, and we reduced churn all the way from 26% to 4%. This drove better results than OKRs ever did. And this was fascinating for me, that the CEO felt like, wow, now I see OHLs, what difference they make, that they give you the ears on the ground so you know how to make measurement actionable. Whereas he described OKRs as the view from the rearview mirror, where you either hit targets or not, you see it in the past, but it's not as actionable. But I guess the most satisfying for me is that Jedis are just so much more fun to work with and so much more motivated. So that's the most rewarding part, too. Okay, now, how many of you are diehard Star Wars fans? Okay, and for all of you who are diehard Star Wars fans, right, you've probably wondered, okay, do we really want to be Jedis? Because don't the Jedis die off in silly ways in the prequels? But to this, I'm going to say, don't get distracted by lazy writing, because this is the same prequel that gave you the cheesiest line, I die a little each day since you got back into my life. Like, oh, yuck. Like, who just says that, right? So let's not get distracted by bad writing. The real question you have on hand is, do you want to be the stormtrooper who is dispensable, who is replaceable, and who leaves no mark? Or do you want to be the Jedi who is invaluable, who's the protagonist creating change, and who leaves a legacy? And so, the question that we have to ask about stormtrooperism versus being a Jedi also applies in our everyday life. Because even in our lives, we could be stormtroopers, right? Because society conditions us that we have to chase all these different social targets. And so what I want to give you is this example of a Jedi in my personal life, in my career, who's made such a huge difference. So this is me. And I don't really want you to focus on that picture with my hair. What I want you to see is the boss that I had in my first internship. This was in Japan in 1997. And he was a real Jedi because he was a researcher, a scientist who was good at experimentation, learning, and adaptation. But he was also someone who left such a mark, such a legacy, right? Because he was someone who just taught me what it means to care for a team. He saw how much it meant to me to be an author on a paper. He could have chased numbers and just published one more paper as first author, but he let me be first author, even as an intern. So 30 years later, almost, I went back and I had to just go say a huge thank you. And so always two there are, the master and the apprentice. So this was my Jedi master, right? And you can leave a legacy. And so now finally, you have the recipe for how you can create change. And you have this choice. You can either be that stormtrooper who chases metrics, or you can be that Jedi who leaves this legacy by experimentation, learning, and adaptation. And the recipe is not use the Force or let chaos reign and reign in chaos. You now have the recipe where you can do puzzle setting and puzzle solving using OHLs. And the way you do that is, even if your company is dead set on OKRs, you can still apply this mindset of puzzle setting and puzzle solving. And you can do that by defining the puzzle and summarizing it in an objective. And then you can start solving the puzzle by asking the three essential questions, which is, how well is it working? And this is where you can define a hypothesis. What have we learned? Where you don't just regurgitate numbers, but think about what have you learned and tell the story. And then what will you do next if you had a magic wand? And you can build this Jedi discipline very systematically without the burden of process. And so If you would like to use this approach, you can get the OHL's toolkit. So you can just scan this QR code, and I'm working on my second book. And this second book is going to be about why goals and OKRs don't work and what actually does. So if you use OHLs, you are welcome to share with me your experience, and your case study might just make it into the book. So I'll let you get that. And you can also get this same toolkit from the Radical Product Thinking site. You're very welcome to message me on LinkedIn. I always love to hear from people and how they're creating change. You can ask me about workshops. And lastly, you can also get the Radical Product Thinking book. And with that, I'd love your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Radhika.
Thank you.
So, we will take questions from you in a minute, because Thomas is going to walk down with our throw box. I heard, my brother told me a story this morning that he accidentally hit someone with that box once because he wasn't paying attention. So I'm warning you, so we're going to throw a thing around. It's very soft, so don't get scared, but please pay a bit attention. So I think, so if you have a question, raise your hand, and Thomas will get the throw box that has a microphone in there for you. But I have a question for you first. How do you like OKRs?
I love them. No, just kidding. No, I have never liked OKRs. And here's the secret. There's someone at Google that I was talking to. Even though Google is the one that evangelizes OKRs, I was talking to the anonymous Googlers who were like, we just released OKRs and evangelized them so that we could kill our competition.
I love that, the anonymous Googlers. All right, do we already have a question from the audience? Just raise your hand and don't be shy. Be the first. Be the Jedi. Be the first.
Go for it.
There's always good fun. So you can just speak into this. So this is a microphone. The Throwbox is a microphone. If you speak into the black part of it.
I've never seen that.
Yeah. This is cool.
Yeah, I know.
Great. So I think all of us have kind of had OKRs in some point of our product journeys. But what confuses me in what you presented is, okay, I get it, we need to solve puzzles, but how do you measure success of your work in the end? Because in a way, the way I see it is still an OKR. You mentioned you increased sales, the sales doubled, but isn't that as well an OKR? We're just not calling it an OKR.
Yeah, so sales doubled, right? But it's not that we were chasing just the number. So here's the difference. When you just chase the number, you might go about it in ways that are very short-sighted. At an organization that I worked at, we chased numbers. So what happened was our low end was getting eroded, middle tier was getting eroded. We managed to hit numbers just because we were going further and further into the high end, and it worked until it didn't work anymore, right? You often do things in an unsustainable way when you're just chasing numbers. So it's not that we don't measure success. On the contrary, we measure a lot of metrics. The point is just not this mindset of chasing numbers. And how do you measure success? Even if I'm setting a sales puzzle, I might say something like, our market expects us to hit X million by the end of this year, but I see a puzzle, right? Sales have grown in the last 3 years and they've stalled in this last year. What might be going on? Is there a fundamental market shift or competitors are doing something? Or is it that we knew how to sell to early adopters, we don't know how to sell to the mass market? That is the puzzle that I might still set. And that's what we need to solve for, right? And what I see progress as when people present it to me in this way of what have I learned, what am I going to do next, all based on how well is it working, then I know the depth of people's thinking. How are we actually solving the puzzle? Not through short-term like hacks, but rather like through really solving the puzzle and seeing meaningful business results.
Yeah, thank you. Which is pretty much a fundamental of product management. So it seems like the product organization when you joined was in a way corrupt and over-focusing on OKRs and not doing the real product job, at least that's how.
Well, here's the, I wouldn't say it's a corrupt product organization, right? This happens in most product organizations that I see. And here's the fundamental issues with just chasing numbers. What happens when you set a target? Just think about the mindset. When you set a target, the incentive you create for people is, I want to show you that I've hit the target. That's my mental bias. I want to show you that we've hit the target, OKRs are green. So I tend to look for the positive numbers, even without malicious intent. I look for the positive numbers and I want to show you, ta-da, I've hit that number. Whereas what is happening is I've often ignored the bad numbers. And it's ignoring the bad numbers that is the real peril, because what you really would need the team to do is to look at the bad numbers, play detective, and say, I wonder what just happened there. Why is that happening? Is that an opportunity? Is it a puzzle? You don't want them to sweep that under the rug. That's the key problem with OKRs and with targets. What you need is to invite the good and the bad. That's what How Well Is It Working does, because you invite the nuanced good and the bad.
Perfect. Anybody else with a question or just the wish to catch the box once? Over there. You can also throw it. You can throw it. Oh, that was perfect. Like he was protecting himself. See, that's the good thing. Like, it's good that I said that before. But was it hard? Was it? No, okay, see, we have a positive reference there.
So, hi. You were talking about hypothesis.
Yeah.
And what is for you, for Intel, a good hypothesis, a product that comes from Intel? So imagine you're a product manager at Intel and would have thinking about, for example, the GPU example that you made. What would be there in a hypothesis?
Rather than use Intel as a hypothesis, I'm going to give you actual hypotheses that we used, right? Sorry?
I meant a product at Intel.
But the thing is, to write a good hypothesis, you have to know the product so well, you have to know the market, you have to know the experiment you're trying. So, which is why, given that I don't know the Intel product, I can't. So let me share the hypothesis format. First of all, the hypothesis format is, if we run this experiment, then this is the outcome that I expect because this is the connection. So I'll give you the signal example of a hypothesis that we had, which was if we offer this feature of allowing people to access lists of these vessels, which is what they use on the desktop. If we allow them to do that on the mobile app, then the outcome we expect is people will be using the app because that is what they need when they're on the go. And what we found then is the leading and lagging indicators. How many people are using the app and how many people are using that functionality, right? And so from that, we can then deduce what did we learn. And then she looked at all of those metrics around what are people actually doing? What are the different things that they go to? What questions do they seem to have in mind? So regarding the Intel hypothesis, one of the key issues is unless you really, really know the problem at hand, it's hard to formulate a hypothesis. This has been one of my learnings, by the way. When you struggle to write a hypothesis, often it's because we don't understand the puzzle well enough, or we don't understand the market or the issue at hand well enough that we know what is that first attempt I'm going to use to solve the puzzle. Right? And the hypothesis is basically, what is that first attempt at the puzzle? This is why I wasn't speculating on Intel's products hypothesis, because that is not my product, right? And so I wouldn't know the first attempt at that puzzle for that product.
All right. I think we have time for one or two more questions.
Yes. Hello, my name is Sergey. Thank you very much. And it's fun because yesterday with my son we started to review, watch Star Wars from the beginning. And I just for my understanding, I get the impression that OKRs and OHLs, it's not contradictory because they both start with objectives. And I have an impression that you approach your vision OHLs it's the beginning of OKRs. So we start in both cases with objectives, then we have to understand hypotheses, and based on this, maybe later identify key results. Is it related, OKRs and OHLs, or not really?
So, at Signal, for example, right, they had OKRs. And what I found was it's really hard to convince leaders, and I have a lot of empathy for this. It's hard to convince a leader, you know what, just drop OKRs. Here are the issues with OKRs. Even though, right, a lot of you have faced the issues that I'm talking about with OKRs. For a leader, OKR is the devil I know. So even if I hear all the side effects with OKRs, it's really set aside. It's hard to say, okay, I'm going to drop OKRs and do something different. And so OHLs, the very name, it's to guide a gentler transition. And first of all, I don't even tell leaders drop OKRs. I say, you know what? You want to use OKRs? That's okay. But I'm just going to introduce this puzzle-solving approach with the team. Right? And so just do it. Like I just started using OHLs with the team to be able to solve puzzles, bring in this experimentation, learning, adaptation mindset. And then we started presenting information in this way at the monthly business reviews, et cetera. And OKRs were sort of just by nature sort of de-emphasized because they became less important because they could see the results we were achieving through puzzle solving. So this is why I called it OHLs, because it sort of sounds familiar, but at the same time, I'm not trying to say drop this altogether. This is a gentler transition.
Thank you. Yes, so it's a better interpretation because often OKRs are interpreted as KPIs, just numbers, and that's all.
Yeah.
And you are focused on objectives.
Yeah, focusing on the puzzle part. Yeah, the objective is not just sort of handed down from above, like grow the business. It's more like, okay, the business, we want to grow it. We want to achieve this growth trajectory. What is the problem? What's getting in the way? Right?
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we have time for one last question, and then Radhika is also going to be here the whole day. So if you have a question for her now is the time.
Don't be afraid of the box. It doesn't hurt, apparently.
How do you know?
I like the...
Over there? All right. Throw it.
To answer the part about how do I know, it's like in Shrek, there's the king who says, it's a risk I'm willing to take.
I catch it.
Perfect.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation, for sharing your history and also your story. Maybe my question will not be related to the framework, but I'm really curious how you actually select the right problem to actually solve and actually increase the sales, because you said the problem was mobile app, but why not to improve the desktop?
Oh, yeah. So actually, I was just giving that as the example because I think it's a much simpler example. The maritime industry is probably one of the most complicated industries I have ever worked in, and I've worked in many. But here goes. Like, we were actually focused on what is the bigger problem. And so I'll define the puzzle for Signal. What the problem statement was, at Signal, it was the tech-savvy brokers in the maritime industry who were mostly our customers. And so the problem statement was, wait a minute, why aren't the tech-averse users in other roles in the maritime industry, why aren't they using Signal? Right? So that was the puzzle. And so in terms of the guiding questions, we were wondering, is it that, just our approach is too complicated? What are their mental models like? We had to go figure that out, right? And so that's the puzzle solving part that we did. How well did it work? Our first guess was, we have all these different ways that we create lists, that there are all these filters that are so complicated. We thought our first guess at this puzzle was, let's make this filtering a whole lot simpler, then the tech-averse users will use it. So we tried that. And it turned out, actually, you know what? Nobody cared. Like, they did not care about filters being easier. In fact, they did not care about lists at all, right? That was our first attempt that completely tanked. And what we realized was, it's because their mental model is different. So what did we learn? We learned that the way these users, the tech-averse users in the rest of the industry think is, I have a cargo. Don't make me filter lists. That's not how I think even. For this cargo, what are the vessels? So how could we help them answer this question in this mental model? And that was our next attempt. And that was what we said. This is what we'll try next. How can we shift this altogether? Forget the lists for these people. So that was sort of how we went about the puzzle setting and puzzle solving.
Basically was the hypothesis, right? So you try it with mobile app, and this was the hypothesis, and it's actually work out.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So now you can see even how I talk about the hypothesis. It sort of becomes a natural way of talking about the hypothesis as I describe how well did it work.
Perfect. Thank you so much for sharing, Radhika.
Thank you.
Please give a grand applause to Radhika. And I also have a little something here for you.